I couldn't understand much of your introduction because I don't speak Swedish, so I'm very grateful that you are allowing me to speak in English, because in the UK we don't learn other languages to be fluent. So I'm very grateful to be here. I'm very honoured to be here. But I would just like, because I couldn't understand the introduction, I would love to get to know you just very quickly for maybe 1 or 2 or 3 of you to tell me what you hope to learn about and discuss today. I know what this conference is about, but I would like to know what you feel strongest about and what you would really love to discuss today. Would you mind 1 or 2 of you to tell me, to open up so we can start the conference being open?
One of the things Anne said in her introduction was about the UN leaders coming with descriptions of definite actions that they're taking, not just we need to do something. So what I hope to take away is a definite action that we can take at our museum to show that we are caring about these issues.
Okay, are you English? Yeah. Thank you. Okay, yes, so action and not just talk. Anything else? Yes, hello.
I work with program and temporary exhibitions, so for me it's very important to know how to communicate this and in what way to communicate it to people, so we don't get the shame and blame, but positive, like, yes, I really want to do this, I can change my life in this very concrete way, and take small steps to actually change your whole life, not just making one thing one day and then forget about it the rest of the year.
So it's good to learn from our failures, but in a time of difficulty where we need to be acting fast, we need to be accelerated in our learning, and so we need to learn from each other. Is that your...
Yeah, and then show people what they can do instead of what they're not supposed to do. Because if you always get told not to do this, and this is bad, and it's like, what should I do?
Yes.
What is the actions I should take?
Yes. So that, possibility, finding possibilities. Yeah. Any other feelings, desires? Yes, hello.
Understanding how to reach the target group that doesn't read the exhibitions or the museums and so on. But we do have a very good at actually thinking the target museum, but we are also reaching out.
Right. Yeah. Okay. Okay, well, I'll take on board those 3 points, and I assume that you have many more. Let me just... yeah, thank you. So, yes, I'm going to talk about what kind of museum is possible in a planetary emergency. And when I say museum, I'm really talking about museum practice. So I'm actually talking about us, the people who make museums, and the participants, our communities, who make the kind of dialogue and learning and inquiry that museums do. So I'm not talking so much about buildings. I'm not defining museum as building with things in. I'm thinking very broadly about museum practice. So what kind of museum is possible in a planetary emergency? So, this image here is a reminder. It's our lodestone, our touchstone of the planet that gives us the possibility to exist. But this planet is in crisis. This planet is rapidly becoming less able to sustain biodiverse life and human civilization. So, it's a beautiful, beautiful thing, and it is in trouble. It's calling for our help. So I'm going to be talking about a little bit about myself, my journey and how I come to be here which again I feel is a great honour. I'm excited to be given the time to talk about my ideas, because very often in conferences everything is very rushed. Everyone has to have their time, their space to talk about their project, you know, my project, and we don't often have enough time to talk about our stories and to ask questions of each other. So I'm really grateful for the spaciousness of this conference, and I really hope to give back in my speaking to you for such a long time. And I also want there to be time for you to ask me questions too. So I'm going to talk a little bit about my journey, and then about the projects that I'm setting up now to respond to this emergency. Then I'm going to talk a little bit about some other museums in the UK that are also responding to the emergency. Then I'm going to talk about some big issues about time and urgency, and then summarise with some key points about the possibility of museum practice in this emergency. So I'm going to have this as a backdrop to just tell you a little bit about myself. These are the global temperatures over the last 170 years. If you go to the website showyourstripes.info, you find a project by a scientist called Ed Hawkins. He's a British scientist who is trying to standardise the information, the data, the way that climate data is presented, so that internationally we all have a common visual language to understand the rising temperatures. So he wants the blue to red to be a standard colour. So I've started to wear blue and red most of the time, and I carry around with me these stripes so that whenever I can have a conversation about, to show palpably, visibly, this change in our living conditions, in our habitat. It is, in a way, this diagram, it's like a museum in itself. It is like a museum of temperature. And the big question is, what about here? Quite a lot of climate science and a lot of stories that we see being told go back into the distant past to show the history of climate. But the big question is what comes next year and the year after. What colour will it be? And so, in a way, this is like my museum. I carry it with me. I'm not sure exactly when I was born, but I was born in 1967. And the temperature was already starting to impact. Well, actually, there have been localized impacts of climate change since around 1907. And then climate change was really starting to have an impact in the tropical zone of the planet in the 1970s, and particularly in the Sahara, the Sahel region of Africa. And then the oil companies in the 1980s, when I was a teenager, they really knew that their impacts, their activities were going to devastate the planet. But they carried on. And they carried on in a way that was to continue to expand their activities, to deny the impact of their activities, and to start to control. We're now seeing so much evidence now that the fossil fuel industries and their associated industries are really starting now to control our democracies. So it's a hugely political situation that we're in. And that's why it's so important that we take time and space to talk about this, because it isn't just a scientific issue. It's not even just an issue. It is everything. Everything is at stake. I said I would talk a little bit about myself, so you know why I'm talking about this. So I'm going to be open with you. I'm 52. When I was 10, I went to Canada, where half my family live, and I saw the beauty of the wild landscape, and I also saw the beauty of that wild landscape being devastated by logging. So aged 10, 11, 12, I really became an environmentalist, or actually a wishful environmentalist. I struggled to have an outlet for it. I didn't know how to... I very much felt whenever I saw on the news anything about pollution or road building, I felt it, and I just didn't know how to do anything about it. So I've always been very frustrated. I work in the arts. My studies were always in the arts, and there's always been this separation. When I was studying history of art at university, we did units about landscape. We learned about the picturesque, the sublime, these big questions, but we never learned about the devastation of the planet, colonialism, the forces of power that are changing our landscape. This was not a discourse that we explored. The political discourses that we explored were about gender, or those were the comfortable topics, but we didn't explore the devastation that was already happening and changing our planet. And this separation has frustrated me throughout my career. So I was talking almost daily about climate change by around 2005, 4 or 5, because when I read the stories about climate change, I knew how significant it was as an issue, and I couldn't understand. I was like Greta now, she cannot understand how people can be so blind, so stupid. I at the same time couldn't understand why we weren't talking about this every day. So I decided to leave my job as head of learning at the British Library so that I could spend more time doing consultancy work where I could start to talk about the planet and integrate it into my work in culture. Now, that turned out to be a really slow journey because I had to earn a living. I had to run a business, and there were no contracts for work that was uniting climate action or environmental action with culture. And also, I'm not a technical person. I'm not a technologist, so I couldn't be a sustainability consultant. I'm not interested enough in, how we... I don't know enough about energy, buildings, lighting. And for me, as a learning person, it was never big enough as a job. So every contract I took, people would say things like, "Oh, please bracket out climate change. I know you're interested in it, but please put it to one side." So even 3 years ago, we did a big project called Future Views, going around the country, consulting with young people and adults in cities about the future. And I was told in this contract, bracket out climate change, leave it to the side. But every workshop, we would ask young people, what's the biggest thing that worries you? Climate change. Of course. Climate change and other related issues, war, Trump, Brexit, they are all related. Those are the biggest issues for young people of all kinds. So last year, I decided that was it. I was not going to I'm not going to take it anymore. This separation, this bracketing out, it has to end. We have to, I felt it was inauthentic. I was separated too much. So I had to set up a project that would integrate my concern for the planet and the insights I had. And this is not to say that I wasn't active. I was involved in so many projects on the side. So I set up a project called Everyday Ecocide, which is about, have you heard of everyday sexism? So it's inviting people to call out examples every day in normal thinking, normal media, of how we forget and ignore nature. I've been involved in the Remembrance Day for Lost Species, which is a annual remembrance, acts of creative remembrance for lost and for extinct and endangered species, and many other projects. But none of them were earning me money. None of them were integrating enough. So that's a little story to how I came here. I'll explain in a minute what I'm doing about it, but just a little bit more context. So our house is on fire. So that means that everything in our world is also, metaphorically or actually, they are on fire too. All of our art, all of our museums, all of our heritage are threatened in some way. So, what is the role of culture? What is the role of art when actually we're looking at a world that is on fire? So, we can't give up. This is a crucial moment when we come into our purpose, when I think museums and art absolutely can prove their value. There's been so much talk about the value of art, so many poetic words spoken about the value, and also so many reports about the economic value of culture. And usually that's about attracting tourists to a place, or attracting investment to generate more money. Usually advertising for industries that damage the planet in the long run. But what if we think that art and museums can help to alert us more to danger? Just a little digression again. I've been very exhausted over this summer. My doctor says really I should be taking time off, but this is the moment when everybody wants what I can offer. And somebody said to me, you're a highly sensitive person. This is actually a type. There are maybe 15 to 20% of the population are highly sensitive people. And I realized, oh God, that's why I'm different. That's why I'm so alert to the changes in the environment around me. I can smell changes, I can feel changes. And so people like me, and maybe many of you too, because I think we are strongly represented in the art and museum sector, we are like, canaries. We know that things are changing, and we empathize with people. And I believe in a way that museums are sites of sensitivity. So highly sensitive people think a lot about the past and the future. They ruminate and they anticipate. And in a way that is what museums are. They are places where we come to think a lot about the past, but also, I showed you this part, the future. We've thought a lot about the past, and this is the point where we need to think more about the future. So yes, they alert us to danger, maybe to help create a safer world by helping us to imagine and build a safer world, and also, most importantly, to care for those affected. So I think that the emotional role of museums or museum practice is a big one to explore. So I asked, can a museum be a first responder to the emergency? So do you have this term it means like emergency service. Putting out the fires. So in 2018, I decided to set up a museum to test the idea, and that is Climate Museum UK. The logo for it is two speech bubbles overlapping, because it's really mostly about conversation. It's a museum to trigger and support people talking and coming to find common ground. So it's a mobile and digital museum that stirs and collects responses to the climate and ecological emergency. So people do often ask, where is it? I am based in London. I have a little studio. The collection, which is growing, is all around me. And one day I do hope that it has a place that people can visit, but it won't ever be a single large building that people travel to. It will always be a much more porous and mobile idea. It both stirs and collects response, and stirring comes first. So the objects that we are making and taking out to places are primarily about stimulating emotional expression and response, as well as learning. But we're collecting ephemera. So we go to protests and collect things, banners and posters, and we're digitally collecting. I mean, I only had the idea a year ago, so it's a very, very small and emerging project, but it does have big ambitions. And although it's called Climate Museum, it actually embraces the planetary emergency. And so the term climate and ecological emergency is what we use. It embraces the breached planetary boundaries. And these are the principles. So it's intersectional, compassionate, planet-kind, consultative, holistic, positopian, and I'll explain positopian in a minute. So everything, positopian. Have you heard this term before? No, good. This is my term, my invention, and I want to know if other people are inventing it, because, there's a zeitgeist. Surely other people are coming up with this idea too, but I haven't heard anyone else use the term. Being positopian is being as open as possible to all of the possible scenarios of the future. And that means not being stuck in utopian or dystopian positions, not being separated in your position and not arguing with each other, but able fluidly to move from seeing the very worst possible scenarios to then thinking about the very best possible scenarios, but then exploring how those scenarios can weave together. So, it's quite a complicated concept to explain, but it feels to me that it is an answer to this constant arguing we have at the moment about whether we can be hopeful or doomed. At the moment we can't say whether we have huge reason for hope or huge reason to despair. We have to always focus on the possibility of survival and the possibility of human ingenuity to bring about that survival. There's nothing else that we can hope for. It has to be hope in the possibility of our imagination. And so we, as museum practitioners, we have to be positopian spaces. We have to help other people imagine the very worst of what can happen with intersecting impacts of climate change and other breached planetary boundaries, and, you know, the worst of the way that people react in difficulty. And we have to help them imagine a regenerative future. How are we going to shift the system from the extractive, exploitative, damaging, harmful way of living? So yes, post-utopian is a huge principle for me. So the model is that we're going through a process. When I say we, it's me a lot of the time, but there are 8 or 9 volunteers, and we regularly meet for workshops, and we open up the workshops to artists and anybody that wants to come. And then we also pop up in when people ask us to go to festivals or conferences, and we take some of the tools and find out what people think of them. So it's very experimental. Nothing is fixed. Everything is a learning opportunity. In my day job as director of Flow Associates, I'm an evaluator. So I'm always constantly thinking about how to improve. Apparently that's a characteristic of people who are highly sensitive. They always want to improve things. They're so aware of their environment. They always want to things to be better. So at the moment we have, it says some of the 25 tools, but I did that slide some time ago. We now have 40. They're sort of game-like activities. They quite often make use of found objects. For example, the fans, I found those, and we painted the climate stripes on them so that people can open them up and try using, you know, fan language. In the past, people used to use fans to communicate with each other. So, you know, it's about creating non-verbal messages. We do lots of creative activities. Quite a lot of the resources are about emotion. So we have a large mood catcher, which is a bit like a Rothko painting with lots and lots of colours on. And we invite people to explore how they feel when they learn about the devastations to the planet. We also have a growing library, actually the most popular part of the pop-ups is the library. People spend a lot of time exploring the books, and parents often say to us, we need more books for children about climate change. There's nothing there. Lots of books about nature, you know, encouraging a love of nature, which of course is good, but there's nothing to help parents talk with children about this change. So that's one book that we hope to produce. One of our new volunteers is a publisher, has worked in publishing, so we hope to be doing more publishing. So here's an example of just some of the pop-ups. We have these Arctic sea ice umbrellas. One of the umbrellas shows the sea ice in 1979, another in 2018. And the future umbrella is red, and we invite people to say what they would put on the future umbrella. These pop-ups are really small scale and absolutely no budget. We've had no funding. So I'm showing that it's possible to do museum work about these issues with no money. You know, you can just use things that you find in the street. The most important thing is to do it and be creative. The first exhibition is called Climate Talks. This is, we've popped up and they have been like mini exhibitions, but they're more like workshops, really. This is a proper exhibition. We've commissioned some artworks from young artists, and it's in the Onka Gallery that I'm a trustee of. And it's part of the Festival of Change, which is the Museums Association conference. I'm sure you've heard of the MA. So it has 10,000 members. It's a very big annual conference. So I'm really pleased that the exhibition is part of that conference. It will be on for a week next week, and the delegates will come for a workshop on how to engage with the public on climate change. Something funny has happened to the design there. The poster doesn't look like that. Now, I was all on track setting up Climate Museum round about Christmas, and a colleague of mine got in touch and said, I've got this idea. You know that councils, I don't know if it's happening in Sweden, but councils in the UK are declaring emergency. Is that happening here? Yeah. So she said, I have an idea. What if we set up a movement to encourage artists and cultural organisations to declare emergency too? Because if their council hasn't declared emergency, it would encourage them. If the council has declared emergency, it's an expression of support. So together, we brought in a few other people and we set up this big movement. It's massive, it's global and growing. Culture Declares Emergency. And we launched on April the 3rd with a grand procession around London, going from one cultural organisation to the next. The artists Ackroyd and Harvey, who they grew these grass coats. One of them says truth on the back. And yes, I know a horse. It created a spectacle. Some people weren't too happy with the idea of us using a horse, but it was very well treated. So these were the first declarers of emergency. And since April, we've now had several major events. We had a big gathering of 300 people at the Roundhouse. Next week we'll have, this week, on Friday, we're going to have a rally of the imagination in front of the National Gallery in Trafalgar Square. And then next week we are curating the Festival of Change at the Museums Association Conference. And then next year we're going to do a major participatory project called, we need a better title, so please tell me a better title, but it's called Stories of Extraction and Regeneration. So it will invite museums and heritage groups everywhere in the world to surface stories of how people have suffered from an extractive culture, and stories of how we can overcome this and create a regenerative culture. And this will end with a big conference and performance in Glasgow during COP, the Conference of Parties in December 2020. Yeah. So it's a big project, and I've been doing all the admin and all of the communications. And so I've had, 3 jobs. But it's starting to change now. So, it's a growing global community of arts and culture practitioners. And now there are separate groups of architects declare, music declares, it's burgeoning. There are also local groups. We have Culture Declares Paris, Culture Declares Berlin, Melbourne, New York. So there could be Culture Declares Sweden. We provide a sign-up form, a public list of declarers, an online toolkit that helps you pledge and then promote your pledges, but also to take action. So we're trying to share learning. It's a learning community, essentially. And we also do strategic advocacy. So, for example, in the UK, the Arts Council, which funds most museums, they've just consulted for a whole year to produce their strategy for the next 10 years. And I know that many, many people when consulted by the Arts Council, said the climate emergency is top of our agenda. So then they issued a new strategic statement saying this is our next iteration. What do you think? But it didn't reflect. There was nothing in it, really, apart from one single statement about the climate emergency. There was no description of how cultural policy would respond to the emergency. So we've just written a letter, from all of the declarers movement, to Nicholas Sirota, the director of the Arts Council, to tell him what we think. But not just to protest, but to suggest alternatives. We'll see how it goes. How have some museums responded to the emergency? One of the principles, the first principle of responding to the emergency is to put the earth and its crisis at the core of your work. So I asked on Twitter, what if your sustainability committee or environmental policy was renamed an emergency response group? Would that change its agenda, and who would take part? So, quite often if you name things differently, it can shift perspective. So an example of a group that is starting to do this is Norwich Castle Museum. Incidentally, that was my first job, the first place I worked. They have integrated the environment into all of their policies and activities, and not just, we will make sure that we don't have plastic cups across all of our activities. It's much more, addressing the needs of their audiences and the place. Norfolk is very flat and it's very threatened by rising sea levels, for example, so they're thinking about that. So a good emergency response is to support activism. And we're really seeing a huge rise in museums asking, what do we do about young people? We've been putting young people at the heart of our policies for the last 5 years, and now they're on strike. Now they're, telling us that they care about climate change. But what do we do? So an example, Oxford's Museum of Natural History decided that their entire autumn youth programme would be called Let's Talk About Climate. So every Saturday they run events, and they're progressive, they move from theme to theme. And a purpose of this is to give young people the agency and the skills to speak truth to power. So it's not just teaching about the science, it is teaching them to take action. So another thing is a really difficult thing, and this is about accepting that museums are not neutral, and that politics is absolutely interwoven in a response to the emergency. We have to expose and tackle the causes. So, as I've said, there's a long history of extractivism that's led us here, and now our democracies are corrupted by what I call pollutocrats. It's my shorthand term. They are sponsoring culture, but also now, in the UK, because our current government and the Brexit situation is really, about the fossil fuel and ecocidal industries wanting to carry on their activities. They want to carry on with what's called predatory delay. They want to carry on with large-scale ecocide and not to be blamed or punished for it. They want to carry on with parasitic globalism while pretending that the public are unhappy with globalization. And they're promoting an impossible futurism. They're not post-utopian. This is so I've been very involved in the Art Not Oil movement. This is a protest in the British Museum against sponsorship by BP, who used to be the Anglo-Persian oil company back in the day. And just an example of what you can do, you can refuse fossil fuel sponsorship. We've set up a project called Oil Sponsorship Free. You can get the logo on the bottom left to say we will not take money from oil companies. And Onca in Brighton is one example of an organisation. You can also, I mean, this comes back to the first response of putting the earth at the centre of your activities, being ecocentric. But in a way, a key point needs to be made here that we need to see all species, the whole of more than human life, that needs to be embraced as equal with humanity. And just a little digression here. Some people argue that when climate campaigners put polar bears and other species in front, that it's forgetting humanity. They say things like, oh, people care more about animals, so it's a way of, drawing them in, hooking them in. And I just don't think that's true. I think that we have an absolutely deeply rooted desire to be biophilic. We love nature, we need it, we are nature. And so I don't think we should use and exploit animals to get us to think and feel differently. I think that that museums have a role to show us that the more than human world is also interdependent with us. It's about equality rather than taxonomy and hierarchy. So, an example: Bristol Museum has recently put funeral shrouds on their extinct and endangered species, and they were asked to do this by children. A school group wrote to them and suggested it. So this is what I mean about biophilia and love for other species is a natural thing. Children have it. And then the final thing that museums can do is to place social well-being within ecological limits. So this is the Kate Raworth's donut model. Is this familiar to you? I'd like to know actually. Can we do a show of hands actually? Because I'm interested. Who has seen this before? Okay, not too many, but a few. So Kate Raworth is an English economist who has come up with this model inspired by the Stockholm Resilience Institute's idea of planetary boundaries. And what I like about her model is that she was frustrated by the argument between human well-being and biodiversity. They so often argue, people are more important, animals are more important. And it's, actually, we have, it's essential that humans are treated justly and equally, and that in this unfolding planetary crisis, that we really, really care for those who are at the front line, who are being affected first and worst. And those people, everybody has a right, to food and water and all of the things that make life worth living. But there is an ecological ceiling. There are limits to growth. It's a really very basic idea, but our economy doesn't operate with this principle. So there's a project called the Happy Museum, which has actually been going for about 10 years, using these ideas. So Kate Raworth came up with this donut around the same time, about 10 years ago. I contributed to the Happy Museum Manifesto when it was first written, and recently I've been evaluating the project. There are currently about 60 museums in the network, and it's really an inquiry, a shared inquiry about how the museum sector can respond to the challenge of creating a more sustainable future. And the title, Happy Museum, has been a bit criticised because some people interpret it by thinking that it is about hedonistic happiness or simply about human, a sort of therapeutic idea about culture making us feel happier. And many of the projects, particularly in the early days, were about that sort of thing. But gradually, through more and more training, workshops and gatherings, more and more museums are starting to do work that is exploring ecology and the limits to growth. So just some examples. The Woodhorn Museum in the north of England, in a place that used to be the biggest coal mining colliery in the world. The UK originated the technology for mining coal. This place is no longer operating, it's a museum. And so they've been doing a project called the Coal Forest, which is exploring wood and the fact that so much wood had to be chopped down, trees had to be chopped down to build the pits, to prop up the mines. And also they've replanted the forest that was chopped down all those years ago. The Lightbox in Woking is a museum and a kind of art centre. And they've really tried to embed sustainability messages in everything they do. So it's not just about making the museum operations more sustainable, but surfacing all of those decisions so that all the people that come into the place know why those decisions have been made. They have not done very much public engagement about the climate, however, because it's a conservative council, a conservative local government, and the money comes from them, and they feel it's impossible to address climate issues in their work. So there's quite a lot of museums have been in that situation. The Beanie Museum have done a project about air pollution. That's a museum in Canterbury, which is an area where, because it's rural, everyone owns a car, and it's all around the city. It's very polluted. In Oxford, I've mentioned one of the museums in Oxford before, but there's actually quite a large group of museums who are part of the University of Oxford, and they've joined up together to form a sort of centre for social change and well-being, so that the museums share their learning and make sure that they're not competing, that they're doing this work collaboratively. So that's some examples of what museums can do. I'm just going to sort of